Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Kittenbrink, and I am excited to have some time with you uh, to share and talk about ethics. The title of my presentation today is called "Living in the Gray Zone." When I was initially approached by Mike Miklos to discuss ethics for the conference, I think my first response was, "You have to be kidding me." I you know, I have a complicated personal circumstance that I feel like, you know, as I said to him, by the time I put my feet on the floor in the morning, I've typically had to contemplate or collaborate, you know, easily a dozen ethical situations in our circumstance. So, and his reply to that was, well, then that's why you'd be the right person to talk about this topic. And since he hasn't led me astray before, I will trust him that I'll be able to hopefully share something that you find meaningful or useful today in our talk about ethics and the application to the kids and the families that we serve. I will, be upfront and honest that I am by no means John Bailey. I have by no means focused heavily to the, I'm not the most well-read person on ethics. I'm not the most well-versed. I don't have the code memorized. That being said, I do care deeply and passionately about the quality of the work that we do as a behavior analytic community. So I'm going to start us out with a little quote. It says, "Far and away, the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work that's worth doing," by Theodore Roosevelt. So I'm very grateful. I love that I found my work that was worth doing so early in my career. And I think that, in the throes of the chaotic schedule, particularly in the circumstances like we're living in right now, we have to refocus that and really recognize that, we have work that is worth doing. And yeah, it may be require us to work hard, but it is absolutely worth doing. Our families and the children that we support need our efforts. They need our efforts to be strong. They need us to be more than people are there that are just there to punch a time clock or to push some papers around. The opportunities and the potential for changes in individuals' qualities of life are 100% dependent on what we, in a lot of situations, are providing them as behavior analysts. So, we can ask ourselves, can we afford to give anything less than 100%? Can we afford to have behavior that is anything less than ethical? And I think when we reflect on what we've been given, it gives us some perspective. So when we've been given the ability to, for most of us to learn skills without excessive trials, without repetition, without someone explicitly teaching us how to do things with specific teachers and with teaching procedures, when we've been given the theoretical and conceptual explanations of our founder, B.F. Skinner, or the great Jack Michael, or the complex explanations of David Palmer, and we've been given the eloquent clinical work of Vince Carbone and Mike Miklos, Mirus DePuglia, and Francesca Degli Espinosa. They've given us the gifts of how and when and where we can apply these principles and conceptual frameworks that have been given to us. And so many other behavior analysts have led this charge for us as well. So, right now we live in a society where there is potential for people of all means to be able to access ABA. And if it's not already in place, it's in the works. Our government has recognized that our field is providing a service that is necessary for our families that we support. So, when I evaluate, how can we not give 100%? I think the answer is that we have to give 100%. We have to give more than 100%. So one of the areas that I think is necessary for us to focus on in order to really ensure that we are standing up to the assignments that we've been given by taking on membership in this field is that we need to really think very carefully about ethical standards, and we need to really consider what we're doing to limit any potential harm that could come to those that we serve, to our field, to our colleagues, to our coworkers, to our science. And because of the rapid growth of our field in the recent years, I think it's even more important that we make this something that we consider and reflect on. So I'm going to share a little bit about my personal story. And I'm going to share this because I think that it's very helpful for behavior analysts as professionals to see a perspective that is not the same as a perspective that comes from other professionals or solely other professionals. So I'll share the story of my children, and I'll be sharing videos and kind of examples of our journey throughout this presentation. And the purpose of that is not in any way to disrespect them or to invade their privacy, but and I hope and pray that someday that they recognize that the reason that I've shared their story is so that talented professionals can learn and help other children feel the same successes that they've been able to feel. So I recognize that that there are elements of it that may be uncomfortable, but I also recognize that if other families hadn't shared their stories, hadn't shared their videos, I wouldn't be able to say that my children have accomplished all the things that they have. Being able to share examples obviously can expedite the learning process and provide a different perspective that is very difficult to replicate without observation. So that being said, I will share the stories of my kids and my family today, and that is to help people and on the whole understand kind of a different way of looking at a particular situation. So I on the left side of my screen, I think it's probably a left side of your screen as well, is a picture of my daughter, Lawless Lily, and she's 3 years old. And then on the right is my son, Gilbert Jeff. I can say that during COVID, we've gone completely off the deep end with the themes. We've kind of got to the point where we were kind of trying to do anything we could do to spice up a week of in the home. So each week we have a different theme, and this week has been Western Week. So that's why they're on their posters with their cowboy hats on. So, you know, both Lily and Jeffrey have autism diagnoses. Lily's 3 and Jeffrey's 4. And they both are significantly impacted as a result of their disability diagnoses, but in very different ways. So the ways, you know, that Lily is impacted are just drastically different than Jeffrey's, but they both are impacted significantly. That being said, they've both made incredible progress. So I never could have possibly understood the magnitude and responsibility of behavior analytic work until I became the parent of 2 amazing young children with autism. So, you know, I recognize, and I've loved what I've done, and I've loved the population that I've worked with for a very long time. That being said, when you transition from seeing this work as a job or a passion, and you move it into a 24-hour-a-day cycle where it's necessary to observe very small changes in the environment to be able to understand, teach, problem solve, and improve conditions or situations for your children, then you start to look at the world in a different way. So there's no more checking my behavioral principles at the door. Doesn't matter how tired I am or whether or not I want to watch my favorite show or read a book or how bad my day at work was. And on face value, that's probably, sounds a lot like parenting under all circumstances. But for most people that spend even just a short period of time with my family, they walk away saying, well, that was a different experience. A different experience than the typical experience. I wouldn't change our family for anything in the world. And I'm so, so thankful for what I've learned and who they are and what they've taught me. And I think our family is absolutely perfect, and I wouldn't want it any other way. That being said, I recognize that the things that we have to analyze and review and pay attention to and focus on are very different than a typical family environment. So, when I think of where my children were just 2 years ago, and where they are today, I can truly barely contain myself. I could shout a list a mile long of things that we accomplished, from sibling and family aggression attempts up to 30 times a day, to a place where we no longer qualify for speech and language services, or from a place where we were having difficulty eating and swallowing food without choking, to a place where we can, eat freely and not have concerns. Those are incredible accomplishments that I know that we couldn't discuss without the science of behavior analysis, without my friends and leaders in the field, without an incredible support system, without an outstanding team of behaviorists, and a lot of prayer. I know for a fact, without those things, my family wouldn't have accomplished all of those things. So to my tribe of behavior analysts and supporters, there's no way I'll ever be able to repay you for all that you've done for my family. For those who introduced me to this field, long before I knew how vitally I needed to understand this information, I am so forever grateful. And when I'm talking to a group of people that don't know me or my circumstance or my situation, my hope is that what you can take away from it is that your role is incredibly important. The outcomes that these children can have are drastically different based on what you choose to do with your time with them. And it's in many ways unlike the concerns that, other parents have. Most other parents can move forward in life recognizing that their kid is likely to learn things through just kind of naturally occurring situations. There is significantly less concern when a parent doesn't have to be worried about setting up contingencies to teach all things that a child needs to know. So when there is a profession that specializes and has the knowledge, the principles, the science, the evidence to back up what needs to be done to help support these children, we need to do whatever we can do as a field to support that moving forward. So, my firsthand account of the power of ABA has only made me more passionate about a field that I was already head over heels in love with. To do what my kids deserve and what all kids deserve, and what all people deserve, we need to preserve the integrity of our field. And discussing ethics seems like a really great place to start. So that's where we'll begin. So I thought one way to kind of start off our analysis or discussion on the topic of ethics would be to get a little bit of perspective about maybe what some maybe, 1989 cartoon might have reflected upon our field. So let's see here.
Hiya, Buzz. Meet Gadget. Careful. The professor has been motivating Buzz, too. Nice to meet you. How about a little demonstration of maze running, Buzzy, old boy? Sure, Sparky. Hey, what about my motivators? You know, I need them to run the maze. Oh, why would you want to run the maze?
Because you asked him to.
I did? Well, then he'll need his motivators. This sign gets him ready to run, and this tells him where to go.
Ouch!
Never get in the way of a motivated guinea pig.
What happened?
He took a wrong turn. Don't worry, Buzz gets a real charge out of it.
He looks like he's not even thinking.
That's the beauty of it. Action without thought. The professor says thinking wastes time.
Well, he's sure not wasting any.
Well, how'd I do? Do what?
We could do better than that.
Sure you could, mate.
Okay, so how on earth did I find that clip, you ask? I can thank COVID for the releasing of Disney Plus, which has then resulted in at least a short period of entertainment for my family, where my son started to explore some shows from the Disney Vault and Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, which is actually a show that I watched when I was a younger person. Had this episode called Does Pavlov Ring a Bell? And my son, for one afternoon, was really into this series and had a couple play in a row. And this one popped up and I thought, well, wow, isn't that interesting? Who would have thought that, in 1989, I would have been kind of being given an interpretation of behavior analytic principles through the producers at Walt Disney. So I think some things to reflect on, though, when we're looking at maybe what the outside world might see about what we do is interesting. So I think the good thing to keep in mind here is this is experimental work. So obviously the interpretations presented here are not necessarily reflective of like the application to human subjects. So obviously no people were harmed in the practices observed. But there were quite a few comments that were made at this point and throughout other points of this episode that kind of lead one to believe that maybe the practices that are observed in this video clip or in this session are less than ethical or optimal. So there was a comment that was made that, you don't have to think if motivational variables are manipulated. So essentially alluding to the fact that, that thought isn't necessary if kind of motivation is a variable, or in this situation, reinforcement and punishment. And so obviously they were not familiar with some of the works that had been that were around on kind of the whole conceptual understanding of some of the procedures that were maybe being replicated in this episode here. It says he looks like he's not even thinking, and that's the beauty of it. The professor says thinking wastes time. So it seems as if, they're alluding to the fact that by like kind of actively manipulating behavioral principles that somehow implies that kind of, behaving accurately and quickly means that you're not thinking, when, we know to the contrary, often when individuals can respond accurately and quickly, it means because they are very fluent in the content, that they are very knowledgeable in that content. So they also have Norton Nimble is the evil scientist in the series. So he is the scientist behind the experiments that were being observed. And so, is a behavior analyst is being portrayed as an evil scientist, which is probably not that great. And in this situation, what they were specifically, what Norton Nimble was doing in the episode was actually training the rats to run this maze, which was a replica of the sewer system that is underneath the city, so that he could go in and take money out of the bank through going up through the sewer system. So, slight plot twist, obviously. But, when we look at ourselves as a profession and how we're being kind of represented in this situation, it doesn't seem super hot. And then thanks to my behavioral modifications, at 14 minutes and 7 seconds, they said, thanks to my behavioral modifications, I have real brains that act like robots. And those of us who have practiced under situations that where people maybe are not a fan of some of our practices, it's not uncommon to hear people make comments about, training looking robotic or it not being naturalistic. So I think obviously those that know the field and the science and the values behind our work and its application to improving the quality of lives of the individuals we support know that getting individuals or animals to respond in a certain way doesn't necessarily have anything to do with manipulating a real brain to work like a robot. However, that's how it's being portrayed in this. So I think it's a little bit of a comical clip, but I think what it represents is maybe some of how we might be portrayed to other communities, to the outside world, which are relevant, are really relevant to think about, because those are the same cartoons that, other families have watched, that other people have seen, that other professions may have been exposed to. And whether it's a cartoon that's a comical spoof on elements of our field, or whether or not it's, actual commentary on a blog or website, the reality is that there are often perceptions of our field that are not super positive. And I think it's our goal, as we're analyzing to ethics, to somewhat unpack some of why that may be the case and what we can do and how we can do our part to improve that, so that ultimately this incredible science that we have can be impactful and shared with other people. So, in addition to some of the components of our science being controversial and kind of counter kind of the a psycholinguistic or mentalistic approaches to analyzing, responding, there have been some things in our history as behavior analysts that have also made our situation even more challenging. So the Sunland, Miami scandal in 1972 was a residential abuse scandal that kind of is representative of a lot of similar situations that happened in the late 60s and 1970s, when behavior modification started to become more widely used to intervene or to support individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In that particular circumstance, there was issues with beatings and sexual abuse as punishment, restraints as punishment, and a number of other absolutely kind of horrific interventions. There were calls to kind of identify and set standards among states and policies as to the potential harm of behavior modification. At that time, the training of these professionals was really in the infancy. Behavior analysis training was limited. So a lot of the individuals that were working at these residential facilities or programs had very limited training. There was not very much attention given to the function of the behaviors that were being observed. There was no ethical code or guidelines for the application of the principles. So it was really not fully understood or explained. With that being said, despite the wrongdoing of many, behavior analysts have continuously been at work to improve the lives of others. So, I started to go down a rabbit hole and to look at more of the history to share. And I have to be perfectly honest that, it'd been quite a few years since I had reviewed that content. Imagine that I didn't just graduate yesterday. But what I found was that it was really challenging for me to to view some of the video footage and content. And I think, you know, being that I'm now a parent, I relate to the individuals in that circumstances in a very different way than I probably did previously. So, you know, I think there are obviously significantly more examples I could share. But when I started to go down that path, I recognized that I think that, you know, although there have been things that have happened in our past that are not so great, as a field, we have to focus on moving forward. And for every bad video that you see of something that was done with where there was mistreatment or inappropriate application of the principles, there was also, you know, incredible work that was being done at the exact same time. So, and we need to focus on the great things that have been done and the great things that are being done, moving forward in the future. So, to lighten the mood a little bit, I'm going to share a little bit of a video of what it may feel like if you have an ethical concern of some type. Let's see here.
When do they stop? At the
So this is a video of a Friday afternoon. And this is the wonderful team that has been supporting my family during the recent weeks.
Towards the house, Brittany.
And I think those of us that have been in ethical situations.
Hannah's close to her hoop. What's she supposed to do? Stay in your hoop. Stay in your hoop. You're gonna do 3 jumps in your hoop, right? But they can take their hat off, right, Jeff? And put their horse down? And do 3 jumps in your hoop. 1, 2, 3. All right, now find your flamingo or your palm tree and put under your neck. Jeff, are you telling them what to do?
So we lost our leader there. So these wonderful people are being led by my son, who's supposed to be telling them how to get through an obstacle course, but has left the scene.
Wait. She needs to get her palm tree or her flamingo. Jeff, towards the house. Good. Everybody walk. There you go. Straight. Jeff, put that down. Straight. And down. Feel. Everyone feel. Keep spinning in a circle until you feel.
So in addition to
under your chin,
the challenge of just completing an obstacle course blindfolded, being guided by a 4-year-old, we also live on the side of a very, very steep cliff. So so we were really seeing if from a safety perspective how much we could push the limit here.
All right, everybody needs to get a ball.
So this team is obviously an incredible set of troopers here. So
you're doing good, Hannah. Stop right there, Hannah. Turn a little bit less. All right.
So I'm incredibly thankful that you know, despite the circumstances we are in, I have a wonderful group of people that is guiding my family and is doing so with laughter and with passion. So sometimes an ethical concern feels like testing the Advanced Early Behavioral Intervention Curriculum, or EBIC checklist, from Francesca Deglia Espinosa at my house for my son, because really it is truly entering a situation that's blind. So and there's kind of in most situations when you have an ethical scenario that's concerning and you're feeling in the dark or blind, you're definitely not laughing the way that those folks are. So often when we're confronted with situations of ethical concern, we're a little bit unsure of exactly what to do. So whether you work at a large behavioral health agency or you are a sole provider in a CF, kind of like an eclectic intervention role, then you're going to be faced with ethical decisions daily. So the good news about our current situation is that the BACB provides a really nice comprehensive guide in the professional and ethical compliance code. I'm sorry, the professional and ethical compliance code for behavior analysts. So in 2001, the BACB released guidelines for ethical practice that were kind of less explicit and not necessarily as rule oriented. And then in 2016, they replaced the guidelines with this particular document, which is the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. And in doing so, made kind of the ethical components of our field, they are actually, rules that must be followed as opposed to suggested guidelines. Given the incredible expansion of our field over that 15-year period, it's not incredibly surprising that it's necessary, or it was necessary at that time, to be more explicit about exactly what the expectations are for behavior analytic practices and how to comply with the standards that are necessary for our field to maintain its standard of care. So I will say that, I do not work for the BACB. My interpretation of the ethical, professional and ethical compliance code for behavior analysts is only that. It is my personal interpretation. I've read things, I've focused on them to try and provide resources and information that's helpful to you. But, I don't have any kind of magical content that is going to give you further insight, nor does the BACB necessarily endorse or agree with anything I'm saying. And my goal is to make sure that I'm representing information that's going to allow you to be successful and to support you in your practice within the compliance code that we've been given. So one of the things that I just don't quite understand is why we spend so much time talking about gift policies and birthday parties. So granted, the BACB does, outline issues that are often explained or given examples that are outlined specifically like gift policies and birthday parties. So, when I'm talking with others, when I've been in other presentations, when I've participated in activities, those kind of more trivial questions about small, concrete examples of things that may result in some type of multiple relationship are the areas which I have seen the majority of discussions regarding compliance focused on. So when people have come to me in my professional experience, the majority of the questions people ask is, so-and-so gave me a gift, what should I do? Or, oh, so-and-so was at a birthday party that I was at. And yeah, I guess, those things are relevant, but they're fairly concrete. So, globally, your goals are don't accept gifts and don't enter into parties or social situations where you may end up with a dual relationship. And, hopefully that's pretty simple. And I think if we break down our ethics code into things that focus heavily on those types of areas or content, then yeah, it seems like it might be pretty easy to be an ethical behavior analyst. But I think when we focus as a community on some of the bigger picture, I think that these areas are somewhat minimal compared to some of the much larger issues that a lot of us are facing regularly. So I was recently collaborating with a team of professionals, and I'm with a family, and during a conversation, the parent, and they were aware that I was having this presentation coming up through this conversation. So I said, they said to the team, does anyone present feel that someone has acted unethically in this situation? And obviously, like, you could hear a pin drop and time pass. And, I immediately, because I can never keep my mouth shut, I immediately said something as soon as I had a moment to think. And my response was, that in that particular situation, as in many situations where we have to make difficult decisions about client care, there's no clear response as to whether or not something was right or wrong. In most situations where ethics is being discussed, there is uncertainty. If there wasn't, it wouldn't be something we were talking about. So I think alongside that is, in a lot of these situations, the complexity of the circumstances often can be attributed to a number of people and a number of acts. So not necessarily a single situation. Again, that's clearly not all cases, right? You post something inappropriate on Facebook, that's a single incident that's going to get you in trouble. But in a lot of these more complicated situations, it's where kind of a number of people have acted in a particular situation that have kind of either made that central situation more complex or more confusing, or as time passed, changes in roles or responsibilities have changed, and that's resulted in some complexity. So in this situation, my immediate tendency was to say, well, there's definitely some things that I could have done better. And I think that is probably true of many of the complex situations that we find ourselves in. So in that situation, and in many, instead of looking at that situation and saying, oh, so-and-so was unethical in a terminal decision that occurred, I think we can look at a number of the elements that led to that circumstance and try to go from there and identify, well, if A, B, and C didn't happen, then we wouldn't even be in a situation for D to occur. So I think we have to look at our acts throughout our professional interactions, as well as evaluate kind of individual circumstances or incidents. So if there was a clear right and wrong, it probably wouldn't really be an ethical situation that would require much discussion or consideration. So in those situations, parties usually would or could quickly follow the kind of the rule governed contingencies, and there'd be no need to discuss it or review it. It would be like, this is what happened, this is the response, and this is what needs to happen moving forward, and it's over. So I guess in my own life, what I have chosen to help evaluate these situations is when I look at my own when I look at a situation, when my own reinforcement contingencies have affected my decision making in a way that it's not in the best interest of my clients, their families, my science, my coworkers, or my governing body, then in those circumstances, I've likely acted in some unethical manner. That would require me to remediate what I've done, to change my circumstance, to change my practice, to change my opinion, in order to ensure that, that my own personal reinforcement contingencies are not influencing the overall well-being of the clients, my coworkers, other behavior analysts, the science, my governing body, the research and practice that we do, all of those things that are so important to us. So one of the first things when we're considering a circumstance that may have kind of some type of ethical concern, one thing you would want to look at is kind of, is there something wrong? And first you would want to identify what your concerns are and probably review the ethical compliance code for clarification analysis. So unless you have that memorized, which I'm sure a lot of people probably do, I'm not one of them, but when you're in a situation where you're feeling uncomfortable or unsure with a scenario, then going to the compliance code in that scenario is probably the best first step. So identify if it appears that there's two elements of the code that are in conflict. So in most of my professional experience, there have been scenarios where there are globally two elements of the code that apply to the given situation. And a lot of times, following through with one of those responsibilities puts the practitioner or in a position where they would not be able to fulfill the other responsibility because of context, because of circumstances, whatever the case may be. So those seem to be the most common concerns. So identify if it's relevant, if there are multiple elements of the code that are likely in conflict, and then seek assistance. So, talking and reviewing these things with ourselves, doesn't necessarily always provide us with everything that we need, and you could even, look to your friends, but talking to people that are not really with you probably isn't going to be helpful either. So, I think what we need to do is have other trusted colleagues that we can bounce ideas off of and identify, who those people are. So it could be a supervisor or someone within your work environment. It could be, contacting someone at the BACB or another governing board for advice. It could also be if a lot of places do have ethics committees now that you can go to, and people can submit anonymous inquiries or sit down and have a confidential conversation about aspects of their practice or concerns that can allow people to really work through some of the challenges that might be weighing on a particular situation. So I think other things to consider is really focusing on communicating directly and honestly with all the parties involved. So, a lot of times when there is an ethical concern of some type, it's challenging to talk about. It's not pleasant to talk about. Most of us are not trying to have long and depth conversations about things that are uncomfortable or that are unpleasant. We like to talk about things like kids doing really well and mastering skills and, life-changing success. We don't really like to talk about when we're in an ethical situation. It's not super fun or positive. That being said, it's absolutely necessary for us to do so, and to do so kind of proactively and openly in order for us to be able to tackle the things that need to be tackled. So, and I think another really important consideration is documenting your process. So instead of just completing these steps internally, or even doing them just, through conversation, it's probably important to actually document the process. So that way you are confident that you've really analyzed all the elements that are relevant in the situation, and that you've taken the steps to an appropriate resolution. But then also, in the event that, you look back on the situation and reevaluate it at some point, maybe you've decided that there needs to be a change, you can go back to the process where you've already evaluated all of these elements then and continue to rebuild from there. And in the event that there was ever a situation where your practices were called into question, that the documentation of your analysis of the circumstances that you were in, and how you came to make the choices that you've made, and what steps you were taking to resolve the situation or to reduce the potential negative impact on treatment or science or quality of care. those would be important things to be able to reflect upon. So, so getting into the practice of documenting these situations is probably a really good idea. So, in 2019, Behavior Analysis and Practice published an article by Rosenberg and Schwartz on guidance or compliance and what makes an ethical behavior analyst. I found this article to be really pretty helpful, which is why I have shared this information, and I'll kind of highlight some of the elements of it that I think were particularly relevant. But essentially, what this article provides is kind of a brief overview of the current issues with behavior analytic ethics. So they talk about kind of the research that's been conducted on specific areas, and what we know about particular elements of ethics and what's been conducted. And overall there's limited research, but there is definitely research on specific topics within ethics, which they, Rosenberg and Schwartz do a great job of kind of highlighting those elements. They also spend a good deal talking about the changes in the population of behavior analysts that have occurred recently. So we are a field that in many ways is still in its infancy, despite the fact that our understanding of these principles has been growing for quite some time. Being a certified population of clinicians, that is something that has become so significantly, has grown so significantly in recent years, that it really, really does require us to look at what we're doing and how we're maintaining equality, because as we know, things that grow quickly without clear parameters in place are not likely to have consistency, quality, the things that our field requires for us to be successful as a whole. And they also highlight the changes that occurred from when the BACB transferred from publishing a set of guidelines for conduct to turning it into a compliance code. And they specifically highlight some of the challenges with the transition to a rule-based code, and kind of what implications that can have for practice. So they specifically talk about 3 situations in which a rule-based code can be challenging to work with, and they provide some alternatives for consideration in those situations. So they talk about situations where kind of the context of the situation makes it challenging for the rule to be applied or argues against the rule. Situations where 2 or more rules conflict, which we have mentioned and we'll talk much more extensively about, moving forward here. And then situations where the cultural circumstances seem to suggest a different course. So there are times where it would appear that in a given cultural context, some of these rules may be viewed differently, and we want to make sure that we have resources and considerations for all of those circumstances. So, because it was mentioned in Rosenberg and Schwartz, I'll quickly highlight some considerations for the cultural differences in ethical practices. So, obviously, giving gifts has been a long established tradition and cultural practice in a number of cultures. And, as professionals and global community citizens, should be striving to improve our service of multicultural populations and recognition of traditions of all types. So, in a lot of situations, you may give a family your food policy and your gift policy as a part of their parent handbook. And, that obviously is something that, we want to uphold to the greatest extent possible. We don't want to find ourselves in a position where we've accepted one gift and then we accept 3 gifts and then we accept 5 gifts, and then, you know, one family is giving us 20 gifts a year, and then that maybe changes the way that we prioritize their services, prioritize their programming or evaluation, which is a risk that we really can't afford to take. That being said, you know, in certain circumstances, a family may bring in a snack to share with staff to celebrate a special occasion, which could be a holiday that's very important to their family, that where they're, you know, using it, the holiday as an opportunity to share their cultural experience with those that are around them. So in those circumstances, yes, it could create a multiple relationship in that scenario. But however, to refuse the food or the gesture that may have been given in that situation could really cause harm to the collaborative relationship, could cause damage. It could be perceived to be demeaning or potentially offensive in relation to race, ethnicity, country of origin, or religion, which is, you know, an additional element, you know, of our ethical code that we are expected to follow. So again, you know, there's an element of saying, yes, we recognize that it's not okay for us to accept gifts, that creates a multiple relationship with concerning. On the flip side of that, you know, in certain scenarios, you know, refusing or dismissing something that has been brought forward that may be representative of their cultural experience and kind of life fabric, that also could create an ethical problem as well that could affect treatment. So it's important to be able to analyze and balance those things. So Schwartz and Rosenberg, they do provide a nice kind of like decision-making graphic or tree that you can kind of follow to help with some of the components that may be a little bit harder. So I've included it here just for quick reference. So the first step that they identify in this process is kind of why does this trigger your ethical radar? So can you identify the ethical dilemma, and then if applicable, does it apply to specific clients, or is it just kind of more of a global issue? And then identify the relevant BACB codes that would be involved, and then identify any personal values or biases that may influence your decision on making on this issue, which I think that point is really important. You know, that is probably the most important consideration, because, you know, it's hard for us to see what we can't see about ourselves. So what about this situation, our bias, our reinforcement histories, our experiences may influence this in a way that is not focused on the elements that are necessary to provide effective support, treatment, and adherence to the beautiful science that we have. So the next step would be brainstorming ideas. What solutions could the code suggest? What are other possible solutions? And then if you then step 3 is kind of to evaluate those. I think this is super helpful. So what issues, conflicts, or tensions might potentially influence each situation? Also, you know, what do we need? Some other important considerations when we're looking at potential solutions would be evaluating client safety. You know, is this decision that we're making something that could potentially put the child or our client at harm? And if so, are there other ways that we might be able to problem solve the situation that would reduce that risk significantly? How do we look at the client's dignity and self-determination whenever possible? Those are, you know, we have to look at these elements that, you know, all people deserve to be respected and have a right to make their own choices. So is there a way that which we can add those elements into our analysis? When we're looking at client outcomes, like what do we think this proposed solution is likely to have a negative effect on client outcomes? Do we think it's going to give us the optimal effect for client outcomes? And how does that play a role interchangeably with these other elements? And then let's see, your impact on your relationship with other parties. So, through making this decision, is it going to, what influence does that have on the collaborative intervention support with the family? What influence does that have on your collaborative work with the coworkers or the people you're consulting with? So how does that impact on relationships with other parties? And then also, what are the family's preferences? So if a family feels very strongly that a particular solution is not likely to be appropriate or successful, it's probably going to be pretty challenging for a behavior analyst to implement that successfully. So I think we have to look at kind of all of those pieces, which play a very real role in what solutions might be feasible and which ones might not. And so then step 4 is just looking at it. Have you found a good solution? If not, you go back and brainstorm. If you have, then you move forward and you look at implementing the solutions with fidelity and carefully documenting all of the actions that need to be taken. So you'll, and then your final step would be to reflect upon the results of your decision. So was this a successful solution or resolution? And do you need to take any further action? And have you learned anything that will affect future ethical decisions? So yes, we have identified that we needed to reevaluate this decision, every 2 weeks for the first 6 weeks, and then every 6 weeks, for the next 90 days till we have determined that this isn't kind of an appropriate intervention for how to manage this complicated situation. Though that would be one example. Or do you need to take further steps because your initial decision that you made maybe isn't being followed with fidelity, or isn't playing out the way that it was anticipated it would? And then kind of how can we avoid this situation in the future? How do we make sure that we set up whatever policies and procedures or systems for ourselves as professionals so that, we don't enter into a situation like this again? And I think those that have been kind of practicing in the field for some time, we've all had experiences that, once we have lived through them, we say, well, I'll never do that again. And I think, part of it is learning kind of the complexities that can evolve from different scenarios and situations. Okay. So the next section that we're going to talk about is the parent as a behavior analyst. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a few different scenarios where we can consider ethical issues and talk about kind of the application of the code. So the first area we're going to talk about is the parent behavior analyst. So so here's some questions that I had to ask myself, and I know other behavior analysts that I've spoken with who also have children that are in need of intensive intervention have potentially found themselves asking. So, I am in a position where I've had a great and passionate career in behavior analysis, and I'm new to parenting, and I see that my child, and in my situation, both of my children are in need of kind of intensive support. So the first question is, can I send my child to someone else for services and support? And so, looking towards the ethical code, I think one of the things I would have to ask is, am I acting in the best interest of the client? So that would be looking at behavior analyst's responsibility to clients, and also like the treatment and intervention efficacy elements of the code. And then I would also have to analyze kind of, would I be entering into a multiple relationship because of my profession? So, and that would be looking at the multiple relationships and conflict of interest part of the code. And obviously, every behavior analyst's circumstances and situation and their child's needs are different that might be in this situation. And so I do really think the context in which these questions are presented are probably incredibly relevant to helping to determine kind of an ethical way to problem solve. In my circumstance, despite the fact that behavior analysis is, has spread widely and there are more and more resources available, in my position, having practiced actively in my area for a number of years, it would be challenging to likely find someone in which it would there not be some element of a multiple relationship with. So then the next question I could consider was kind of, can I work with my child myself? So, there are, a lot of, I've had incredible training from some of the best behavior analysts in the world, and I've received coaching and support and consultation from incredible people. So, if I were able to kind of be the interventionist for my child, am I acting in the best interest of the client? So I'd have to evaluate again the responsibility to clients element of the ethics code, as well as the treatment intervention efficacy elements. I'd also have to look at whether or not I have the capacity to do it. So as a parent of 2 children that were diagnosed with autism, literally 2 months apart from each other to the day, do I have the professional and scientific relationship elements? Do I have the emotional stability and capacity to perform my my skills at a level that that is that I'm capable of as a behavior analyst, or would my potential circumstances interfere with that? And then, I think the flip side of that is for parents, on the one hand, we can recognize that we likely have limitations and biases because of our emotional connections with our kids and the reinforcement histories that we have. And but I think we can also recognize that as parents, we also have a motivation for our children to excel that's going to far exceed that of someone else. So, I think all of us that have worked with families have worked with parents that we have seen, do, incredible feats beyond human belief to support their children, parents that haven't slept for years and have, are up against some of the most challenging behaviors that families can face. And, they are able to have incredible, successful interactions and interventions with their kids because ultimately their motivation is so high. So on the flip side, like, do I have the capacity and, professionally, am I so biased that in this circumstance, it probably isn't going to be in the best interest of the child? Or on the flip side, is it that my motivation is so high that, even though there may be some limitations in my ability to objectively observe a situation, the benefits of my increased motivation may be something that actually works to my children's advantage. And then the flip side is, could my personal circumstances compromise delivering services to the best of the ability? And I think that, undoubtedly in the situation, the answer is in some way, yes. There's no way that that I could completely remove my role as parent and function solely as a behavior analyst, nor would I want to. So, so there's that piece of it. And then, an element of, well, what other additional option could I possibly have? And so, in my circumstance, I've spent a lot of my recent past, prior to parenting, focusing on training other people on how to support and implement strategies for working with children with autism and intellectual disabilities using a behavior analytic approach. So could I possibly use that skill set? And if I were able to use that skill set, like, how would I be able to would that not only potentially allow me to help support my own children, but could it be something that allows for me to support other children that are in similar circumstances? So again, had to review the code and make a lot of considerations. So am I acting in the best interest of the client? So again, we look at the responsibility of client, the treatment, intervention efficacy, as well as kind of would we be entering into multiple relationship because of my role as parent and potentially an employer of some type. There would be looking at the issues concerning multiple relationships and conflicts of interest. Undoubtedly in that situation, there would definitely be likely some type of multiple relationship, because I can't really provide training and separate my knowledge as a behavior analyst. I can't just be, even if I try to position myself in a way where I am just a knowledgeable parent that's advocating for my child's best interest, I found that it's challenging to not be viewed as kind of a professional because of my experience and my training and my professional role. So regardless of whether or not I want to have a dual relationship or a multiple relationship in some circumstances, because of the experiences that I've had, the opportunities that have presented themselves, I'm already in a multiple relationship when I enter that situation just as a parent. So then, I ask myself, okay, well, if I hired a person to be my babysitter, would then that be okay? So, I'll just find, someone that has, no behavior analytic connections to the behavioral community, and I can train them. And then, how's that different than any other parent that's training a babysitter to implement strategies that are most effective for their children? But on the flip side of it, I would still be essentially doing the exact same thing. I'd be serving as both a parent and then as a trainer. And because of the educational experiences and training and opportunities I've had, that's, it's different than the average parent. So I found myself in a scenario where I felt like, what could I do? Even if I did hire someone like a babysitter without behavioral training or connections to the community, then how, would I still have to remove myself from my position as a behavior analyst so that way I could provide that coaching and not be in a circumstance of a dual relationship? Do I have to give up my career in order to be able to advocate and utilize the principles that my child needs in order to be successful and learn and grow? Obviously, that probably was not the intent of these elements of the ethical code when they were written. But when you attempt to apply some of the elements of the code to specific situations, you can see that there are really like limited options in which you're not going to have some type of a concern in one area or another, because life is messy. Life is full of circumstances that you can't control. Life is interconnected and social, and behavioral communities are growing, but still relatively small and well connected when you get to a certain point. So how is it that we can, move forward? And what options do we really have? And I know that, my story is not just my story. I know that other behavior analysts that have found themselves, that are also parents of children that need supports and services, that have found themselves in similar circumstances. Do I have to quit my job as a behavior analyst so that I can advocate and support my child the way that they need? Or is that the only way that it could be ethically done? And I think that the flip side of that is, if I leave my career that I've, passionately dedicated many, many years to developing and investing, countless hours in, what loss does that bring for the clients and the families and the other behavior analysts that I could have potentially helped and supported, if I didn't have to leave that role in order to be a parent that's advocating for behavior analytic principles with knowledge and understanding. So I think some of the things that are important to consider when looking at those questions is kind of looking at things like, well, what's the context of this? So where does the child live? Where's the location? What's their access to services? And what's the parent's capacity? So, I mean, it's kind of cut and dry. And I feel like every scenario that you read, whether that's in, a paper that's written about ethics or whether, a book, there's, commonly a scenario where there's someone that lives in a remote area. In those situations, it seems like it may be more likely that, despite there being some type of multiple relationship, that there may be an ethical obligation to still service the client that in a certain way with as many protections in place as could possibly be developed. However, there are similar situations, even in places where there are a significant number of behavior analysts, because like the specialization or the quality of the behavior analyst or the type of specific services that a family is looking for isn't necessarily something that is easy to access. So even if you don't necessarily live in a remote area, access to the type and quality of services that a particular parent might be seeking is something that should be, or I guess you could argue, could be just as relevant in considering the conditions or context in which the situation is being evaluated as whether or not someone lives in a rural area. So, if I live in a town where all the behavior analysts had very poor training, and that, then that's no, and there's lots of behavior analysts there, that's no different than living in a remote area where there's one behavior analyst. That's really good. So I think we have to look at, kind of all the ranges of gray, because it's not black and white. The situation's not black and white. And I think in a lot of the scenarios that are presented in ethics discussions, we have a tendency to veer towards the things that we could kind of more easily make an argument for. So, oh yeah, if you live in a rural area and there's no people, of course you have multiple relationships, and then you might be able to put these different protections in place. But what if you do live in an area where there are other behavior analysts, but their specialization, their focus, their training, isn't necessarily the type of service that you're looking for? Under that context, if a multiple relationship is to occur, is that, perceived that to be unethical because there are other options, but maybe not options that are suitable for what the client or family is looking for. So I think other elements to consider are the logistical capability of navigating a team to support one child or multiple children. So when my two kiddos were diagnosed, they were diagnosed 2 months apart. My daughter had already been receiving services for her developmental delay from the time that she was 2 months until the time that she was 16 months when we pursued a diagnosis actively. And, the amount of time and energy that goes into parenting two children in an early intervention system that have basically all of the related services that are available is incredibly challenging. So, if I was managing a minimum of 6 to 8 appointments a week for them just with the related service providers in the home, and that's not counting, me trying to, work with them individually and train my husband and my mom and the nanny that we had at the time with how to respond to the different behavioral situations we're working on and how to do these different signs that they're supposed to be doing and what this wall cue means. And then you add on to that, my children both have a lot of kind of co-occurring medical needs that have to be addressed. So they are regularly at specialist appointments. So, when we were having other interventionists come in the house, depending on their training and experience, which I couldn't really control very much of, we were having incredible inconsistencies in the interventions that were being provided. And they were, it was requiring kind of continuous observation and monitoring. So when that was kind of the option that I was looking at for the services that were being provided to me at that time, obviously I became concerned about whether or not this was a good use of my children's time, as well as whether or not it was a good use of my own time. So I think spending a little time in that system provided me with a helpful learning experience and understanding that logistical capability of navigating a team to support multiple young children with intensive needs, it can be incredibly time consuming. And so recognizing that, that's hard to navigate with one child. And it's particularly hard to navigate with two children that are very young. So how is it that, that I could set up a scenario where my children are getting adequate supports and services that they need? So I had to really look at what is physically feasible for me. If I were to continue with the system that had been provided to me as a typical parent with no knowledge of behavior analysis, with no knowledge of effective scientific-based interventions, there's absolutely no way I could have maintained employment at all. So given that scenario, you would have to evaluate kind of whether or not is it actually physically feasible for the parent to do, and what does that look like. So I recognized after only a very short amount of time that it probably was not a good use of my time for me to be advocating to individuals that were not aligned in that scenario with the approaches that were research validated, and in that scenario it seemed in the best interest, given the limited amount of time and the incredible need that my children had at that time, to move on and to identify a more efficient and effective way to support their needs. So but and in that process, I needed to also identify how I was going to protect my children, protect myself, protect my colleagues from potential ethical conflicts, and look at developing some safeguards against the issues that can very easily develop with multiple relationships, and the professional and scientific relationship challenges that were likely to emerge in a situation where I was serving as a parent, but also in some capacity as a trainer. So there were a few different things that we looked at. We looked at, how do we possibly add an outside expert consultant to a situation? So what do I do? How do I bring in, an additional party that can provide kind of objective guidance and feedback, so that way I'm not bringing my biased opinions, my emotions into a particular situation that might be impeding the progress of the clients, might be impeding the professional success of the other behavior analytic team, as well as, could potentially result in conflict. So having an outside expert provide consultation really allows for that relationship allows for the team to function in a way that is guided not necessarily purely by a single source that may be significantly affected by bias. We also have identified that it would be in the best interest, likely in this type of a situation, to have performance supervision conducted by an objective supervisor. So, it's probably not appropriate if you're being evaluated on your performance as an employee and you're working with a child and their mom is the person that's evaluating you. So obviously working to set up systems so that supervision and performance feedback is given by someone that is not that is knowledgeable of the programs and all the needs of the learners, but is not in any way directly involved in the situation where there would be a multiple relationship. I think another benefit for consideration was kind of looking at a situation where the decision making ultimately is governed by a board. So instead of having a single party make decisions for the business or for the circumstance in our, we have a team or a board that's identified to help make larger global decisions that might have impacted the situation or future situations, and then really focusing on having clear and effective proactive communication regarding any concerns of multiple relationships. So basically saying like, hey, we know that this is not ideal, and we do not want this to go poorly for anyone. So let's identify what we think our concerns would be. Let's talk about how we can handle them. And if we feel at any point that we're seeing things that are just really not in the best interest of anyone, whether that's the clients, whether that's the other clients in a community, whether that's the professionals working directly with the kids or with other kids, or it's affecting the science that we support, or it's what we're doing is reflecting poorly on our governing body, then we need to immediately address that through open communication about our concerns. So another element that we think is vital for protecting ourselves in similar situations, it'd be frequent evaluation and monitoring to identify if behavior analytic team is and was in the best interest of the client. So, saying, okay, we're not going to just assume that this is working. Let's review every 6 weeks and make sure that, the kiddos are making optimal progress and that we don't have concerns about their performance overall. And then also on the flip side, having frequent evaluations and monitoring on the effects of the potential multiple relationship and whether or not that's having a negative impact on clients, coworkers, science, governing body, behavior analytic community as a whole. So, so basically saying like, this is what we have identified these potential strategies to reduce the potential negative impact of this multiple relationship. So now let's work towards figuring out how to monitor that frequently and identify what changes need to be made if changes or concerns occur. So, so a question that has been posed to me in talking to other parents who are also BCBAs is kind of, or hearing of stories of their circumstances, just because I'm a BCBA, does that mean that a child can't access the same services and supports as a child whose parents was not a BCBA? So essentially, like, if I'm not a BCBA, my child can go to the best provider in the area. They can go to a school that's receiving consultation from A, B, and C. They can access these specific programs. However, if I am a BCBA that's been practicing regularly in the field and I have relationships with a number of parties and circumstances, then, I may be in a scenario where my child going into any of those settings or situations or receiving any of those services would potentially be multiple relationships. So I feel that, despite the drastic increase in our field over the past 15 years, access to really highly qualified, well-trained, and experienced behavior analysts is still limited in many circumstances. So if there is only one good provider in an area and you have a relationship with them, like, what options do you really have? So I think, if another provider, really feels uncomfortable with a circumstance of working with your child because of a pre-existing relationship with you as a professional, obviously there could be concerns. And if other providers are not evaluating my child's as a client's potential best interest to receive services, then it's very possible, and it happens, that there are circumstances where, no services can be available in a certain situation because of, refusal to enter into a circumstance of multiple relationships. So, creating a scenario. So yes, we are not supposed to enter into multiple relationships. That being said, if there are no options for services for a client, how is it ethical then to create to proceed with a decision that results in no services or no services of a particular kind being available to a child? So I don't think that in development of the ethical standards, it's likely that the BACB was intending for parents that are also serving as behavior analysts to be in circumstances where essentially, their child is more likely to be denied to access and participate in behavior analytic communities as a result of their parents being highly knowledgeable in the content area. However, that can and sometimes is the case. So I think we just have to look carefully at really what are the core values that we have as a science, what is represented in our ethical code, and how do we make decisions based off that information. So something that I've talked about kind of throughout this is I regularly have referenced what is a multiple relationship. So a multiple relationship is just when an individual serves as a behavior analytic provider, but also has some other type of relationship. So friend, relative, babysitter, connected acquaintance, whatever with the client. So I just listed a couple of strategies that you might want to consider if you are in a situation where you feel like ethically a multiple relationship may be in the best interest of the client, but you really want to limit the impact as much as possible. So I think one thing to keep in mind in all situations is ideally, if you're in a multiple relationship and there's a way for you to remove yourself from that would be ideal. So, if you're able to find another provider that provides equal or equivalent services to that which you provide, and they have ability and they're well trained in the areas that the child needs support, then transferring that client would be the ideal option. That being said, we recognize that there's a lot of situations and times where that's not the case or that's not possible. So here's some other things to consider. So you could try the punt, which is basically recognizing that in a particular situation or that a specific responsibility or activity can't be managed, supervised, or supported in the circumstance. So identifying like, hey, look, in this situation, I usually do provide consultation in this situation or to these people, but you know what? Because of my child's circumstances, I'm actually going to remove myself, and you can handle, all work on this will be related with other individuals in the organization or in your situation. So, so finding a neutral party to kind of pop in and provide support is, objectivity as a concern is definitely important. So then finding a clear division of responsibilities and roles. So having active communication about expectations, roles, responsibilities, boundaries, like what is okay, what is not okay, and how to work through those. Having a designated objective collaborator. So, having someone within the community that you're working, supporting, or collaborating with that is identified as a collaborator with an objective perspective. So a performance supervisor or outsider that can kind of really monitor professional interactions and the relationship with particular respect to the issues related to the multiple relationships. So they're aware of the concerns and are working, with you within the situation to provide objective support and data review and analysis to determine what needs to be done moving forward. An additional strategy for limiting that impact would be kind of looking at an outside support or input. So, identifying someone that's maybe not directly in your community, but some professional that you may have worked with in the past, or a trusted colleague from your training or experience that you can use as a sounding board. So sometimes you really truly need a totally outside perspective in order to really navigate some of the challenges. So bringing in kind of an outsider can really help to kind of balance the playing field and hit reset on situations that may be confusing or challenging, or kind of difficult to navigate. And then the last suggestion here would be removing yourself altogether. So if at any point, individuals identify that, through the analysis of the relationship and client performance, that the multiple relationship is having some type of adverse effect on the client, the coworker, the science, the governing body, behavior analysis, as a field and community, then that relationship can be terminated at any time. So I think it's important to recognize that there are times when absolutely it should be decided that, someone should remove themselves from a situation because of the multiple relationship. And, that is an option that people need to evaluate and consider the appropriateness of. So, when looking at the code and kind of making some of these decisions repeatedly in my own circumstance, as I said, like at the beginning, before I put my feet on the floor every morning, I have about 12 or at least 12 thoughts of ethical concern that happen before my feet even hit the floor, because my life is a 24-hour, 7 days a week, often in the middle of the night, behavior analytic puzzle. So as I'm trying to work through all the different elements of how to best support the field that I love so much, the colleagues that are doing incredible work for families, and my own children, I'm frequently brought back to these two areas of analysis, which I think are significant. And so when I'm looking at the behavior analyst's responsibility to their client, and that, identifying who the primary client is, and then the responsibility to, in any given situation, advocate for their best interests. If that's a part of what my role is supposed to be, then I feel that's a fairly significant element of the ethical code that has an effect potentially on other areas as well. The other piece of section of the code that I think is particularly relevant, that I frequently come back to when I'm kind of analyzing these more complex situations, is looking at the treatment intervention efficacy. So our clients have a right to effective treatment, and it needs to be based on research and needs to be supported. It needs to, we have an obligation to advocate for that and to educate those supporting the client or the client themselves in scientifically supported evidence-based treatment. And so when I look at the different situations my own kids might be in, these two elements rise to the surface quite frequently, because without these, I know that in a lot of circumstances, the experiences and interventions they may have received in other communities would not necessarily align with their best interests or the most efficient or effective or research validated treatment intervention. So I think, reflecting on these elements, I think, does help to frame looking at our professional behavior as a whole. So, is the code weighted? No, the code is not weighted, right? So it doesn't really matter. The way the content is presented is you're responsible for all these things, and these are what we are supposed to do. And if you break these things, then you need to remediate them. And if it's a concern, then it can be reported and you can be investigated for it, right? So, so what do we do when following one element of the code kind of results in us breaking another? And I think that's kind of what the majority of this conversation or this talk is about, is that there are a lot of circumstances where potentially following one element of the code does result in breaking another. Unless you kind of separate yourself completely from feeling as if a potential client's benefit is outside of your responsibility. So when we look at the code, the most frequent reference is looking at kind of what's in the best interest of the child or the client. And when we break down the code and overlap, analyze for overlap and repetition, there are a few trends. That being said, it doesn't say that there's, we should follow these rules and not follow those rules. It says we should follow all the rules. So, but we need to be analyzing for reoccurring themes as well as for areas that we, feel are necessary in making sure that we do no harm. So, when we look at the, elements like the client's best interest, welfare, effective treatment, protection from harm, those are mentioned 17 times throughout the code. So that leads, at least me to say, okay, I think that's probably, if it's coming up that many times in this document, then that's probably something I really need to evaluate and spend some time looking at. The other one is that comes up fairly regularly is the BCBA's responsibility to act, provide services, and supervise within their own areas of competency. So that's mentioned at least 7 times in the code as well. So essentially saying, here, like, no, the code's not weighted. You're going to have to make decisions that are going to likely result in sometimes, a circumstance where you may be temporarily or for some period of time in questionable violation of one area of the code to fulfill what you ethically feel like may be the responsibility of addressing another area code. However, when we're analyzing these circumstances, it may be relevant to look at these reoccurring themes and say, looking at kind of child client welfare and interest, as well as whether or not the acts that were being analyzed or assessed are within the competency of the provider. So, so the next scenario that we're going to talk about is the lone soldier. So I call her the lone soldier plus the new kid on campus. So, she's a newly certified BCBA. She's practicing in the field of special education. She's bound by the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. She works in an environment where behavior analysis is not widely accepted or utilized. The newbie recognizes that she's knowledgeable of the principles and needs to provide, proficient and effective instruction and quality interventions to improve quality of life. But in her particular role, her direct supervisor repeatedly asks her to change her approach to instruction to align with the practices that have been utilized in that community in the past. And, the newbie has concerns about whether or not these practices are really going to be the most effective and efficient, whether or not they're going to result in generalized and generative skill development that's ultimately going to help these kiddos respond best under natural sources of stimulus control and throughout all contexts of their life. So, yeah, I think there's probably quite a bit of us that have experienced this or have seen this throughout our professional careers, and it's a real, a significant concern. So, and it really comes down to not just looking at the newbie and the lone soldier and whether or not she should be advocating for specific interventions and how she should be doing that, but it also really taps into a much larger issue, which is kind of supporting the dissemination of ABA to non-behavior analytic communities. So, we're not really just talking about the newbie and her supervisor, but we're talking about more this kind of global issue of, we, as behavior analysts, we often work in communities where behavior analysis is not the prevailing conceptual framework that is utilized for instruction and decision making. So in those scenarios, there are a lot of ways that we can try to address these issues. So in her particular issue, following the recommendations of the supervisor for instruction in most situations would minimally result in a violation of kind of issues with developing behavior change programs that are conceptually consistent with the science. So that would be a concern that would be identified within the ethical code. However, refusing to implement the supervisor's recommendations could develop in a situation where there'd be questions of professional integrity, issues with following through on obligations to contractual professional commitments and high quality of work, as well as issues with conforming to the ethical codes and social professional communities in which one practices. So on the one hand, I have this obligation as a behavior analyst to provide these interventions that are research validated and supported. And on the flip side, I have, if I don't follow the recommendations that are being provided by my supervisor, I'm creating a scenario where I'm potentially violating other areas of the code related to professionalism and working within social communities. So I think that we need to look carefully at this situation because the situation is quite common, at least in my experience, and commitment to the science definitely needs to be a part of our analysis of this situation. But also recognizing that, in order to share our science with others, it needs to be accessible. So to, tell our supervisor as a new BCBA that we don't agree with anything that they were doing. We went to school, we're behavior analysts, and we know what works. It's probably not going to result in a scenario where we see a lot of change in that community. So if we are, if we were to turn down all recommendations that are not behavior analytic in nature, in a lot of situations, we would make it very unlikely to help other people learn about the incredible, powerful principles of behavior analysis. So if I shoot down everything that you say, you're likely not going to listen to a whole bunch of what I have to say, nor are you going to be likely to think that my ideas are very good. So I think we have to look larger at how is it that we can kind of turn the ocean liner and still be maintaining compliance within our ethical code. So what can we do? How can we identify changes where we are moving towards, how can we towards compliance and towards stronger adherence to the science, which we know and love, and how can we bring that into a community in a way that it's well received. So again, it's about identifying those strategies, that are likely to assist with that process. So, I can, work within the range. I can pick an area that is not a focus of my community and do a project on it that's completely separate and see if I can introduce behavioral analytic principles in that way. Or I can take a problem that my community has had extreme difficulty identifying how to work through and offer the option for an alternative program or idea. So kind of fix the problem using your strategies or your attempts. So, if we don't turn the ocean liner, then who will? If we walk away from all environments and where behavior analytic principles are not being utilized in the best interest of the kids, then it will be, our worlds as behavior analysts will get smaller and smaller. And instead of spreading the science that we know is so helpful, we could end up in a situation where we are operating in small pods with like-minded people, helping only very few compared to what we would be capable of if we took on some of these other broader challenges. So yes, absolutely, you may be in a situation where you cannot always put every most effective treatment in place for every child in order to move forward with the ultimate goal of being able to help those children and other children like them in similar situations and circumstances in the future. So if we don't take steps towards that change in these communities, that haven't been exposed to quality behavior analysis, then we can ensure those clients and children will likely never be able to access conceptually systematic, effective, and efficient intervention. So, right, this isn't the kind of question of like, should I accept the cookie that so-and-so's mom gave me when they were walking out the door? They put it in my hand. I didn't know it was there. This is like a much much bigger issue. It's just how do we navigate bringing behavior analysis to communities that are not that maybe well situated for accepting the science, the principles, and the changes, and how do we do that in a way where we are still able to bring effective treatment, improved treatment, or improved outcomes from our scientifically supported behavior analytic interventions. So the reputation of our field to other interventionists and families and communities is sometimes like really not that great. So how we are perceived by others as a whole, I mean, obviously it's variable, but what Chip and Dale tell us about behavior analysts in 1989 wasn't so hot. And some other words I've heard thrown around over the years is kind of emotionless, know-it-all, removed, territorial, taking over responsibilities of other providers. It's not their job, talking above others, not taking care, respect for emotions or feelings. And I don't think any of those words describe who we are or what we do. But if those are words that have been reflected upon us in some way, then I think we need to look at what we're doing so that we have an opportunity to share our incredible principles with all of the individuals that deserve to access them. So, is it because our history of our field, or is it, because of what happened in the 1970s, or is it because of how we're acting now, that sometimes we're maybe not as well received, or maybe it's just the role in general of being a consultant. Consultant by nature, right, comes in and says, hey, I think you should change things. That's what a consultant does. And so, in order to do that, that essentially means that you're telling the people that what they were doing before was not right. And getting people to think that that's a cool idea is not always that easy. So, I think the nature of our work, plus our history, plus some of these other elements of what we do requires us to really need to be considerate and thoughtful about how we're approaching circumstances in which we're not talking to other behavior analysts. We're talking to people that have not come to understand the incredible power of these principles and the outcomes that can occur when applied effectively and appropriately. So, in these situations, we got to look at both at the ethical codes for responsibility to our profession as well as to our colleagues. So I think one more kind of thing to touch on regarding kind of how we share in circumstances where we're entering a non-behavior analytic community is really looking at, is there a wrong way and how can we share better? So, obviously if behavioral principles are in effect at all times and a child's making progress, then, obviously there are behavioral principles that are allowing that child to make progress in skill development. So, I think quite often we as a BCBA body may be quite quick to identify that interventions that others are doing are maybe incorrect or wrong, or suggest alternatives. And when we know an efficient way to develop a skill, it's kind of hard to sit on it. But I think what we also have to look at and consider are things like, have our recent behavioral histories or reinforcements with particular procedures kind of interfered with our analysis of proposed or observable interventions that could have potentially positive effects. So are there things that we could be viewing and seeing that, because of our recent histories, because of our experience in reinforcement, we're not really observing, or is our covert behavior talking right over top of someone else? Guilt, I've been guilty of it. I'm explaining a situation, the other person responds, and I start thinking about what I'm going to say next to help explain it, as opposed to actually listening to their response, and trying to work with them. And then having, another issue is that could be a concern, is have we failed to recognize the behavioral the principles actively at play, and do we fail at how to explain these principles to others? So, if we were able to effectively demonstrate, the success of behavioral principles and explain them in an accessible way where individuals will contact reinforcement quickly, then, it probably wouldn't be a problem to help other people understand behavior analytic principles. But there's, as much as there is history and all of these elements and the nature and the challenges of our job that we have, I think there's probably also things that we might be able to do differently that could position us so that we could be better received within communities, which ultimately would allow for behavior analysis as a whole to thrive and to be able to help more individuals that would greatly benefit from that. So I think, another consideration that that sometimes occurs is that we end up in a situation where, we are able to observe that a child or a situation, a child may be making progress, but we can see concerns maybe with whether or not that skill that's being presented is being learned flexibly, or whether or not it's being presented in a developmentally appropriate sequence that's likely to generalize. So I think, also looking at, it just, are there circumstances where, because of our history, we believe there's a more efficient or functional way to approach a situation? Do we create, barriers that make it more challenging for the long-term explanation, acceptance, and use of potentially behavioral principles by different members of different communities? So again, here looking at what could we possibly do, and how could we look at things differently to potentially to better our efforts as a community as a whole. So responsibility to our profession, as well as our colleagues, or other elements of the ethical code to consider. Okay, so the next section is the plea for help. So this is another scenario, again, a scenario that is not unheard of. So as skilled professionals with a lot of opportunities, many behavior analysts move on from one position to a new position. Sometimes when leaving the past position, the gap of a great BCBA is quite hard to fill. So sometimes, there are long gaps where kids don't even have somebody that's available to support them. Other times that gap is filled with someone with less experience or less training. And so a few months down the road, we'll say in a scenario, a parent contacts you and says, "Hey, I really need your help. My kid that you were helping in the past, in your past position, I know you are in a slightly different role there, but I'm begging for your help because my kid's regressing significantly, and they're struggling with essentially at this point all aspects of daily life. So can you consider helping us?" And in your situation, you may be the only person at that organization that has availability for a new client, and other providers in your area might have 6 to 18 month waiting lists. And you might be concerned about the quality of the services those other providers have, or the variability that exists within those communities. So in that situation, you're kind of, in a tricky spot. Obviously, there are elements identified about discontinuing care, and issues with interruptions to care, On the flip side, you're also responsible as behavior analysts to whatever contractual agreements that you've entered as identified in the ethics code. So if you break your contract by, doing something, related to that client, then obviously that would be an ethical issue as well, potentially a legal issue as well. But if you don't support this child that is in desperate need of support, then you're denying them like the potential for effective treatment, not working in their best interest, et cetera. So refusing to support a client will likely do harm to the client. So you'd be looking at the content, the responsibility to the client, as well as the treatment intervention efficacy. Serving the client obviously enters into a multiple relationship, which is complicated. So there's some considerations, which would be moving the client off of the caseload as soon as another clinician is available, or making considerations for continuity of care obviously would be important as well. Looking at reducing strategies, so reviewing strategies to reduce the impact of the multiple relationship. Again, the ones we outlined earlier, like the punt, clear communication about roles, boundaries, responsibilities, designated collaborator, outside input, or other options would be kind of do not enter the relationship or put on a wait list for another provider. And those are the other options of potential support. So I think that, again, it's not black and white, and obviously particular contracts and like things like that would play a role in a lot of these situations, but not always. So another complicated situation, a little bit different, would be the cream of the crop. So essentially, you as a behavior analyst have worked with a professional in another organization in your past, and you guys worked great together and you support kids well together, and you're very successful in helping kids make a lot of progress. So you're now in a position where you can have some influence in the hiring of a new team member at your organization. You're aware of other qualified candidates that have been interviewed, but the candidates are neck and neck on paper. And you know that you worked really well with your friend in the past and from your former workplace, and she would likely be interested in a change in position. So you could send your inquiry to see if she might be interested in the position, obviously making sure you're following all employment laws. And she's a talented behavior analyst and vital employee and leader in that current workplace. So we know that she's got a lot of great skills and that she would probably be a wonderful asset, but you have a pre-existing relationship. So with our talented temptation, some considerations is kind of, will that pre-existing relationship give you favor if you joined your new community, and like what would the ethical implications be for other coworkers? So, if you already had a relationship with this person and you brought them in, and would that potentially create a scenario where there would be different opportunities for this new person that might not be present for the other behavior analysts? And then would taking this vital team member of the organization cause for a disruption of service to the children at that other place, which in most situations is highly likely. And then what role does this play as an ethical concern? And so, how do we take thought into the potential ramifications of removing a talented and skilled behavior analyst from their position by offering them an alternative position somewhere else? So, although that's not necessarily something that's explicitly outlined in the ethics code, it is a very real circumstance where, switching from different organizational structures and positions absolutely can create challenges where the changes in staff or the removal of staff could be at a significant detriment to children. That being said, as behavior analysts, we should have a right to make changes with our career when and as we would like to have them. So, but it doesn't change the fact that when we do make these changes, it can significantly impact the success and the supports needed for the clients that we serve. So, would the interest of my new team ethically prevail over the issues with the multiple relationships and the continuation of services that would be potentially in effect for the, the situation that she left. And, again, another element of this would be about kind of, I guess, the long-term benefit for the science and for clients overall. So, if someone is in a bad position where, hey, they're not getting a lot of opportunity to work in a place that's has a commitment to conceptual consistency and a love for the science and research, then, is it really, truly ultimately in the best interest of the field for someone to pursue or support a shift and change? So I think there's quite a few elements that even when just looking at someone switching their job from one job to another could bring in some gray areas. So this one is called supervision stumpers. And often as a part of our role as behavior analysts, we also serve as supervisors to future BCBAs in training. So, the development and adoption of the supervision experience standards by the BCBA has helped significantly with developing a more consistent standard of supervisory care. When we are a field that's growing so rapidly and a field that is so dependent on quality training, not having a set supervisory standard really made it challenging to ensure that our credential maintained quality and that it really was a credential that was consistent across circumstances and people and situations. And so right. So the BACB has really worked hard to develop these supervision standards that have allowed for much more consistency in the supervision of BCBA interns. So when a BCBA is aware of their competing demands in their employment setting and is offered the opportunity from a local university to supervise another person, what variables might influence that decision? So in that situation, like, does the supervisee, what supervisee volume must be evaluated in relation to the other responsibilities of the supervisory experience? So if, for example, there's no specific number of supervisees that you're not allowed to have, other than you're not allowed to have more than 10 in group supervision, right? So how do you determine with your other job responsibilities how many supervisees are appropriate for you to have? And I think it depends on a number of factors, like what other job responsibilities do you have? If you're an experienced BCBA who has a consultation caseload with a lot of flexibility, and that, most of those classrooms or teams that you support are highly independent, you probably have the capacity to supervise additional interns and do so well. If you're a new BCBA that has like a really complex caseload, then you're not going to likely have as much time to supervise BCBA interns. Also wrapped in that is that depending on the quality of the supervisee, their experience and their training, the amount of time that it's going to take to supervise them is very different as well. So, if we're really talking about quality, effective supervision, it's not just based on the minimum number of hours that are suggested by the BACB. It's about creating and supporting quality professionals that we've committed to train in our field. So, I think it's a quite complicated scenario. But if like in a particular situation, the supervisees from a program have been highly skilled in the past and have allowed a business or a team or consultative group to grow in skilled capacity, then, it's highly likely that one would be more likely to consider a supervisee or taking on a supervisee, even with a competing caseload, because the collaborative relationship has a reinforcement history that's strong. It's allowed the BCBAs and the team to kind of test drive these interns before kind of buying the new model as an employee. And it's resulted in, ultimately could potentially result in like revenue options that would long term, if that were to work out, that person were to become an employee and they were able to bring in additional revenue and support for the team, it ultimately could end up, being something that is fiscally beneficial for a consultation team as well. So basically, I think, again, it's not gray, and it's not black and white. It's all gray. So the supervision program and the experience in this situation may be a perfect fit, or, the learning opportunities may be exactly what they're looking for. It might be right next to their house and they have the same research interests as the team. But, there also could be circumstances where it's not in the best interest of the supervisor to take on that supervisee if they can't give adequate supervision. So it really needs to be the kind of thing that's evaluated. So some ways to potentially limit this particular situation, so that that supervisors are not taking on more than they can really navigate, would be to look at looking at developing maybe standards or policies, or just kind of ways of practicing that outline the max number of supervisees a BCBA could carry or support, depending on the job responsibilities and the BCBA that BCBA holds. I mean, I think also relevant to consider is like what program the supervisee is enrolled in, as like the training and the coursework and the experiences from those programs varies so significantly that, the amount of responsibility that you have as a BCBA for supervisees from one university program may drastically different from the amount of time and responsibility that would be necessary to support a BCBA from another program. So those have to be part of the consideration. So outlining a max of saying like, hey, our BCBAs no one can have more than 2 supervisees at a time. That way we know that it's not pushing them beyond their limits. And then a BCBA with a flexible schedule obviously could potentially do more. And obviously there are other ways to navigate it as well. That being said, there probably should be some guidelines because of the reinforcement history that becomes quickly established to make sure that a conflict of interest doesn't develop regarding the quality of the supervision based on the supervisee volume, as well as the potential benefits of taking on supervisees. So I think some other supervision areas that are good to review and just touch upon briefly are ethical, other ethical supervision considerations would be the supervisory competence. And, when you look at that task list and the number of diverse skills that behavior analysts are responsible for supporting, it's a lot. And depending on how well your supervision was conducted as a supervisor, and depending on what experiences your supervisor had when you were in BCBA supervision, it could really limit or affect the type of supervisory experience that you're having. So, or that your supervisees have. So I think that the take home on this one is, if you're supervising and there are areas that are outside your area of competence on the task list, that it's vital to work to become trained in those areas if you intend to continue to supervise, and to identify other behavior analysts who have competency in those areas that can balance the supervision that's provided, to ensure that when someone receives a BACB credential, that they have experience, understanding, and knowledge in the areas that they will need to be successful as behavior analysts. We already touched about supervisory volume, but making sure that we only take on as much as we can do well. And then supervisory delegation. And I think this one is really important to consider. So depending on the circumstances, it's really important that behavior analysts only delegate to their supervisees responsibilities that they can reasonably be expected to perform competently, ethically, and safely. So, when we're getting a new supervisee, a lot of the times they may not have very much experience at all. And so regardless of the competing demands of the environment or the expectations of the setting, we need to make sure that the situations that our supervisees are put in are set up for them to be successful. And if we don't, if they don't have the skills to perform the tasks competently, ethically, and safely, then we need to provide conditions for them to develop those skills. And there is, for those of us who have spent a lot of time supervising a lot of people, there are significant, variation in the skills of supervisees in so many different areas. Those that are on the task list and those that aren't, communicating appropriately with others, professionalism, telehealth, right? I mean, all these things are things that are not things on the task list, but that are really important to being a successful behavior analyst. And so when we are working towards supervision and trying to attempt to achieve ethical professional supervision, we need to really consider these elements. Okay, so the educational systems and supports. So this topic, I've had the pleasure of working in educational systems for almost my entire career. I started out my career as a life skills special education teacher, but I was also a BCBA at the time. And I transitioned from there into working in emotional support program, as well as being an administrator for a specialized school, and then providing consultation in public school systems, as well as other specialized schools. And from those experiences, I can say that I head over here love schools. So despite the fact that right now I'm working quite heavily in a clinical environment supporting families, my passion and my training for many years has been school-based supports. But having been a behavior analyst for my entire career as a school-based professional, I can say that there are times where, our obligations as behavior analysts don't necessarily line up perfectly with the expectations and rules and regulations that are common practice in a school setting. So, some particular issues that come up frequently are kind of issues with, where a child's instruction should be provided, whether or not that be the least restrictive environment for them, and what their meaningful participation in instruction looks like. And then, what is kind of effective instruction for a child. So as behavior analysts, we find ourselves required to comply with the regulations of our related professions, educational, mental health, et cetera. And behavior analysts must conform to the legal and ethical codes of the social and professional communities which they're members of. So we don't really have, an option based on both, the legal obligations of that community that we're operating within, but also our code also supports us in following that. That being said, the range of interpretation of regulations and the application of those to, the policies and practices in particular communities can be drastically different from person to person, school to school, state to state, administrator to administrator. So, we all have these same list of regulations and that are supposed to guide our behavior in a school setting. However, they may present very differently in different circumstances. So when evaluating the appropriateness of a child, like potentially spending a whole day in a general education classroom without access to intensive instruction or intervention, a team may struggle with kind of the legal obligation to the least restrictive environment, polarized with the need for a child to get intensive instruction. So if I have a kid who's very minimal communication skills, very limited play skills, maybe complex behavioral needs and issues with self-care, having that individual participate for the entirety of their day alongside their peers without any type of significant modification to instructional format or procedures could present an issue where a learner may really struggle with developing the skills that are necessary for improving quality of life. So how do we navigate that in a way where we are respecting the community that we're operating within, but we're also advocating for effective and efficient treatment? So, and I think another major consideration in this would be the family's opinion and how they feel about their child's participation in instruction and other activities. So there's my little guy. He is participating in a holiday show, and he's wearing a black snow cap on underneath his lovely Ram headband that he is wearing as he's part of his manger scene. So there's simple elements of identifying. There's more simplistic components of evaluating ethical situations in school-based settings. And then there's quite complex situations as well. So in this particular situation, we were looking at, the behavior analytic team that was supporting him in his educational environment were aware that his participation in this event was something that was exciting for both him and his family, but also a little nerve-wracking. And we were not necessarily very confident in how the situation would go. So, it was kind of a toss-up. And when the behavior technician that knows him, the registered behavior technician that knows him very well, saw that he was enamored with the snow cap that had a light on it before his performance, right as they went out on stage, she slapped that hat on him and put that Ram headband on him. And sure enough, he went out with his friends and he sang his songs and he behaved appropriately and he kept his Ram headband on the whole time, which he apparently had never worn in any other circumstance. So, in that situation, the person that's supporting him is saying to herself, should I make him wear the hat? Well, if I put him on the hat, that could have him have a tantrum. And then if he has a tantrum in front of all these people, like what are the social ramifications of that? And, we're in an inclusive setting where, there could be ramifications long-term if we're not careful about what we expect of him in this situation. So yeah, on face value, again, it looks like, oh yeah, she just slapped a hat on him and he did great. And we were so happy and thankful that he was able to participate in this activity and do so with success. The flip side of it is, had it not gone well, like the potential outcomes could have been really significant. And as far as opportunities for inclusion and success. So I think in this situation, we do have to consider how does the parent or family role play a part in these decisions, and what are the values of the family in that circumstance, and how do we help support that within the decision making as well. So how do I find a way for a child to participate in a community or inclusive activity, but not end up in a situation where I've carved out we're in a situation where the individual is not really actively participating in instruction or engaging activities for long periods of time. So obviously, it's not a simple situation. So intensive instruction allows for increased engagement and opportunity for meaningful engagement. So again, responsibility to clients is highlighted, as well as treatment, intervention, and efficacy. And then intensive instruction, though, could limit access to general education setting, limit opportunities for socialization, or if we were trying to provide that within the inclusive setting, it could cause for disruption of the instruction to other students if the modality was different than what was being taught, or if the instruction was happening in a way that was different from or at the same time as the other children in the classroom. So in this circumstance, intensive instruction supports the client's right to effective treatment and instruction, but could be challenging to implement in a fully inclusive setting. And, all children do have a right to free, appropriate public education that includes meaningful participation in the child's least restrictive environment. So, in this situation, there's not a cut and dry answer. We have the client has a right to effective treatment, and they also have a right to least restrictive environment, and we need to proceed with kind of a analytic approach to the parent input, objective assessment, evaluation of meaningful participation across settings, and utilize all of that information to help support decisions. The last global topic for consideration and discussion regarding ethical concerns is the issues that were posed with the decision by the BACB to discontinue international certification within over the course of the next 3 years. So obviously, when this was announced, it resulted in a lot of different responses to this situation, and the BACB is working towards a transition plan where they're looking to provide support to other countries to develop their own systems. And that being said, there's currently work that is focused on looking at how to do that best in the areas where there's the ability to do so. As a parent of 2 children that's lives are functionally dependent on behavior analysis for them to learn and to grow, I can't even imagine what a loss it would be for the children of the other countries to not have kind of the growing support and dissemination of this content. So on the one hand, I feel an ethical concern that, by limiting certification to the United States and Canada, that there are children that are all over the world that may be less likely to come into contact with behavior analysis as a result of the decision that was made. And having done international work and seen the incredible benefits of bringing behavior analytic principles to those communities, I recognize how great the need is, and how privileged we are in our country to have the knowledge and the resources and the accessibility that we have to effective use of behavior analytic principles and resources, supports, and services to allow our families to contact that. So on the flip side of that, I recognize the challenges that come with an international certification. I mean, the reality of an international certification is that that you would have to be able to somehow ethically monitor the performance of people, that you could somehow handle the ethical reporting, that the differences in cultural employment performance and laws and the way that individuals interact wouldn't necessarily be an issue, but the reality is that they very much are likely an issue, and that's doesn't even account for other issues that the BACB noted, including concerns with the amount of time necessary to translate all the materials and to make the content, website, newsletters, all of those things accessible. So if we're providing a certificate for something that we can't then provide the related resources to support the quality and continuation of care for, then that's also a huge problem. So, what's the value in giving someone a certificate because they passed a class, and they've gone through their coursework and they passed the test, if there's no accountability or there's no system for continuation of supports and services and professional development and ethical compliance evaluation and monitoring. So I think, when we look at all of the issues that are here, and that have been discussed here, you know, I hope people recognize that I am by no means saying that I think I know what is right or wrong. What I'm trying to convey or share is that I think that there are a lot of issues that are um, bigger ethical considerations than some of the other areas that we have a tendency to focus on or discuss. So hopefully, you know, presenting some of these scenarios will at least allow people to start to consider and think about, you know, both the daily practices of, oh, I probably shouldn't take that cookie from that parent. And yeah, it's never okay to post something about a client on Facebook. But also kind of these larger issues of, you know, when we as social beings with pre-existing relationships and small behavior analytic communities participate in great work for a science that we love, for values that we care about to improve the quality of lives of children so that we deserve it, like that really deserve it, life gets complicated. And that doesn't mean that, you know, the ethical code is not relevant. It absolutely is relevant. We just need to take time to really look at it and consider under a variety of circumstances, like what is the best way to address these situations. Okay, so I feel like in the current circumstances, it would be kind of unusual to talk about ethics without talking about some of the ethical implications of the current circumstances with how we as behavior analysts practicing working with individuals with autism and related disorders have had to adjust our practices in order to adjust to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll share a little bit of our situation and then talk about how that has kind of shaped what changes we've made, and maybe that'll give people some considerations for the families that you're servicing. So my husband and I are both in leadership positions in our employment circumstances. So when when our area went into an immediate lockdown, we were both in a situation where we were kind of scrambling to figure out what we were supposed to do and what our responsibilities were as employers and leaders in employment circumstances. So basically, my children went down from having about 100 hours of individualized instruction per week to 0. And, you know, we as a family have become very accustomed to kind of living in a world where, you know, we have our intensive instruction and then we have kind of our relaxation time, and that those two things are relatively separate. However, you know, as we were working to try and figure out what our next steps were as responsible employees and employers, we found ourselves in a situation where our kids started to slowly fall apart, and not very slowly, actually, it was pretty quick. So after only 1 week, we had seen significant changes. So we started seeing my daughter demonstrate behaviors that we had really never seen before. She was, disrobing at really high rates per day. And we were having incredible difficulty when we would attempt to socially engage her. We were seeing errors on mans that she had for over a year. We were seeing behaviors like, of going to the bathroom on the floor, things that just were completely novel too. So some of these things were things that kind of pop up from the past, and some of these things were brand new. And, with the diverted attention of the work responsibilities, having both kids with us for a long periods of time and having limited structure to our days, we were able to burn out anything that had some potential engagement or reinforcing value pretty quickly. So I was working on things like trying to condition the toilet as a reinforcer, and I was blocking different behaviors and trying to run it 15 minutes a day. We were seeing diaper behaviors when we're waking up in the morning and at night, and both, we were also seeing a few good things as well. So, developing a new social routine at home where we were able to get great social responding with new objects in a new condition and new environment. And my daughter responded well to her initial teleconsultation. So I'm sharing our struggle. I initially wrote this down for myself. I was just really concerned, with how quickly things had started to deteriorate, and I felt like I needed to document what was happening so that I could make better decisions for my family about what things I needed to do next and what those things were. And so, so initially we saw really, significant changes that were concerning, for both kids. So, my son though had like a really great couple first days. He was thought it was like summer vacay, like no stressful schedule. I can hang out in my PJs, maybe watch some extra TV, snag an iPad. But as time went on, we, started to see that, our attention was super valuable, and there wasn't a lot of things that we had that were super engaging, and we didn't have a solid structure. So we ended up with a lot of problem behavior. Again, some novel problem behavior, a lot of behavior that came back from histories of past that we hadn't seen in a really long time. So we saw, increasing issues with bathrooming, some scripting behavior. We had, first aggression towards sibling in 10 months, first presumed bite in 7 months. I noted like what I was trying to do, like work with other family members on what our interventions were going to be and how we were going to run them. We're seeing problem behavior with even just drinking liquids. Basically, anytime a liquid was given, we were having problems. So, but we were also kind of burnout and tired and not on the same page, and family unity and consistency were a concern. On the plus side, we did see that, Jeff responded really well to his first 2 teleconsultations from his BCBA, but he did struggle initially with adjusting to direct instruction from his technician, particularly when she increased the response effort a little bit. And we also noted that like her fluency with the digital format was significantly slower, which we felt like was also potentially impacting his ability to engage. And we did see some problem behavior related to the dog, the functions, there was definitely significant increases in behavior that appeared to be under attention function for both kids, which, we recognized that we were not doing what we needed to be doing. So, and, a part of our rationale initially for pulling back the support so significantly, in addition to like the uncertainty of the situation, was that, in addition to an autism diagnosis, one of my kiddos has more complex needs that kind of puts them at a little bit more of a risk in this certain situation. So, so we were really trying to identify like what are the health risks, and how do we balance that with access to effective instruction? Because we know it's a risk for our kids not to have instruction for any period of time, or to even have like a reduction or limitation in their instruction for any period of time. But we also know that there's obviously immediate health risks with exposing our kids to instructors at this time. So, so kind of like the questions we were looking at in our family that I'm sure a lot of other families have considered, and a lot of providers are considering, is kind of how long can we let our kiddos go without the support or adequate support without reevaluating a plan? And then, if we are receiving instruction in a format that's not super likely to be efficient or effective, like what could we, what should we be doing? So if we have learners that we really feel like, they really, may be able to do a little bit of, consultation with the parents through telehealth, but because of their intensity of need or their limited skill repertoire at this time that like tele instruction or is really not that effective. So, and then how do we work on preparing our kiddos for the unpredictable future? So, as the fall is quickly upon us here, we're looking at how do I allow my child to access the outside world safely. So here's our first session trying to work with Jeff wearing a mask, and as you can see, he makes the best of the opportunity, I guess.
All right, show me ready. Nice job showing me ready. Here's a token. Here's a token. Good job. What's this? What's this? What's this?
He said, perfect, a new way to avoid demands.
Show me ready.
Ready.
What's this?
Hammer.
A hammer. That's a hammer. Find the couch.
Mm,
Over here. Find the couch.
couch. Couch.
Couch. Good job, bud. Here. Here's a token. Here.
So right, quite a bit of
Love how you're
mischief.
keeping your mask on.
But
All right.
to
ready?
go from not wearing a mask at all to being able to tolerate a mask for quite a few minutes is
Right, what
is
is
an
this?
accomplishment all by itself.
That's milk. You got it, Jeff. And what is milk? It is a drink. That's right, bud. Nice. Okay. What would you like?
And he appropriately asked for permission to remove his
Okay,
mask at the
right.
end. So, although he did claim at the end that there are no germs there, so he shouldn't have to wear a mask. Which is incredible that he's able to articulate what he can, because even just 2 years ago, he was not able to even tact any basic items. So to go from where he is to being able to talk about how there's no germs and he doesn't need to be wearing a mask right now is a pretty incredible feat. So obviously, in the midst of all that's happening in his current circumstance, with this situation, we want to make sure that he doesn't, regress or lose skills. We also want to make sure that he's prepared for social distancing so that we can keep him healthy and safe, as well as keep the rest of us healthy and safe. So the main issues that we were looking at for our own family and for the other families that I have the privilege of supporting is looking at how do we limit the areas of our ethical code related to interruption or discontinuation of services. And it says, we are required to act in our client's best interest and avoid disruption of services. It even highlights specifically that we need to make efforts to facilitate continuation of services, regardless of illness, impairment, unavailability, relocation, disruption of funding, or disaster. So regardless of our circumstances, we are required to ethically continue with our clients. So, and we can't abandon our clients or supervisees for whatever reason. So that has to be something where if services are terminated, we have to suggest alternative providers and work to come up with a plan to help support that transition. So, when this kind of situation first presented itself and a lot of providers were unsure, there were a lot of layoffs and changes made. And, a lot of providers were saying that, they were, dropping cases for kids that weren't participating or that weren't doing telehealth or they couldn't do this. And, the reality is when we kind of look at what our obligations are here within the codes, that we probably needed to look at how and what we could do better. So, initially we tried a lot of different things in our house. Obviously the first, 10 days we failed epically as parents, as well as a behavior analyst on my behalf. My husband has no behavior analytic training. He has been with me for 22 years almost. And so he's heard a few things here or there. That being said, this is not his profession. He's not trained to work with kids. He's not trained to do anything. So we decided as we were evaluating kind of how to put better plans in place for our kids under the circumstance, what we needed was, ways to actively and appropriately engage our kids on kind of a structured way. And, at this point, we really still had very minimal outside support into our home. So we decided to utilize our BCBA support as more of a training and coaching component as opposed to kind of a tele-instruction component. And so, we made a couple of videos. The videos were not intended for like mass distribution or anything. They were just developed for our own community in the moment of need. So how can we help our families that we are servicing right now? Is there any tips that we've identified from trying different things at our own house that when working with the BCBAs that are supporting their families that might be helpful? So they're not, super professional or well done. They were designed to help our parents kind of look at different ways they might be able to support their kids during this time.
Sometimes I just don't know how to approach objects with her. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I want to help her learn how to play with it or learn what it is, but I also don't want to set her up for failure. You know what I mean? I like teaching her the wrong thing first.
Yeah.
So here we're just trying to provide tips for families so that way if they had a parent coaching session, they were well prepared, I guess.
Oh, are you so excited?
I am. I'm ready.
Okay. So for effective play partner, we're going to be looking at like opportunities for you to engage with her, like taking turns on stuff.
Okay.
And then being a helper. So if she struggles with anything, just jumping in to like help her so she doesn't struggle with anything.
Okay.
And then just narrating what she's doing, imitating her. So opportunities to imitate, which would mean having duplicates and try motivation for another object.
So these are just,
So
this
maybe
is
we'll
just
try a functional play.
one example of,
So you can get the
how we worked with families to help support them rather than, what we saw initially was a lot of push for kind of doing work that was similar to the work that had been done in a school setting or a clinical setting.
and then we give
And
her
what we
third item.
came to find quickly after that is that, for a lot of families, that's really not what their needs were at that time. And that wasn't what our needs were as a family. So working on
Okay.
the treatment objectives that our kids had prior to the circumstance really weren't what was important. What was important was us being able to gain instructional control and engagement of our kids in our home environment, which we've never, we usually are only there a few hours a day, and now we're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without the support that we're used to. So what we found is, we really did help to provide some examples to help families see that maybe alternative options for support rather than just trying to do the same things through a computer screen might be more helpful. So that was one of the changes that we felt like ethically, just continuing to work with the kid really in our circumstance wasn't appropriate. And prior to COVID, our supports that we provide for the few families that we support in our area have been all clinical. We're a really small program, and we just have focused on a clinical program alone as opposed to like a home program or school-based program, because our goal has been to really ensure that we have like consistency and quality of care, which becomes more challenging. But, when we go into different locations, it's harder to supervise, harder to ensure fidelity. That being said, we recognize that as soon as the situation started to unfold, that like our parents are the ones that we really need to be pouring into. So we did, follow some of the recommendations of our colleagues that had kind of gone through some of this before us. So Francesca Deglia Espinosa provided some incredible resources and ideas on what they'd had success with in Italy and the UK. And then we were able to kind of make some changes to what we were doing here with those considerations in mind. So, we did meet with families at times where there was no child present to really talk with them about what their needs were, what their support systems were, what their situation was, and then to evaluate their needs and kind of come up with goals that are more appropriate given the current situation. And then, what this allowed us to do is really to evaluate the whole child and not just the child in a clinic setting, which in our situation, I think was really necessary. So by doing this, I feel like we've been exposed to areas of need that we may have never seen or known had we not been exposed to this situation. And I can say, personally for my husband and I, it brought about a recognition that, you can have really great clinical services for a lot of hours a week and your children can do really well there. But if we don't consider the importance of getting those, getting the same types of responding from parents and from parents in different home situations, then, it's probably not really doing my kids justice in what they really need. So despite the fact that, the situation's not ideal, and obviously the last thing I would want is my children to make, to fall backwards or behind in order for us to identify that there's a need. But I recognize that through this process, we've been able to see both for my own kids and for other families that some of the needs would or may have been very hard to identify had we not had this drastic shift into the home situations that we're in right now. So what we did at my home is we just did a significant change. We structured our schedule. We because both of us were still working, we had kind of shifts with the kids. We have times where we have both kids. We have times where we each have one kid. We have times when people are working, and we rarely, but occasionally have times where a parent is off and not working and not responsible for a child. We decided to structure our reinforcement system very systematically. And so we started with it in kind of intensive instruction, and then we carried it over to naturalistic circumstances. And at this point, overall, we now are able to, globally, under a lot of contexts and circumstances, use just natural social reinforcement. So here's my husband again with no training. I was working with him during this session on implementing the token system for a naturalistic. He's making a sandwich.
Yep, good. Squeeze. Squeeze. It's not working. You gotta squeeze harder. Squeeze hard. Squeeze it. Okay, you wanna spread it? Totally squishy, you're right. It's not hard, it's squishy. Guess who likes jelly? No? Yeah, Lily. Here you go. Good job. Oh. Well, it's okay. She can eat it. You just made Lily a sandwich. How do you feel about making Lily a sandwich? Sure. You're just feeding the masses right now.
So you can see, I mean, if I would have showed you, video of a few weeks prior, we were really having a significant difficulty keeping the children in the same location and not showing dangerous or significantly impacting problem behavior. So to be able to kind of go from that where we were to where we are in a few weeks was super is super encouraging and exciting. And we've seen that, like, when we've kind of made similar suggestions in other families, we've seen a lot of growth as well. So initially to try and, there are periods of time that for our family are particularly challenging, are when there's one parent that has both children for a long period of time. And because of the need for us to both work, but to alter our schedules, that was essentially all we were doing. So basically, like, one person was working, the other person was with the kids, and then the other person would work, and the other person would be with the kids. So essentially, we created a scenario where we were under, like, the worst condition at all times. And as we moved through the process, we just continued to work to try and reduce the amount of time that we were operating in that condition, but then also to really highly structure that condition so that it was likely to result in success. So we broke it down into these activities, and, with, significant support and guidance from my mentor and Francesca de Espinosa, who kind of helped us to get back on track when we were really struggling after our first 10 days. And so we started with doing some IT dyads, just because both the kids were most likely to respond well to that. They both had a really strong history with intensive teaching. So I would run dyads with them to help support them in kind of using the token system, alternating back and forth between kids. And then from there, we moved into different types of activities. So some ethical telehealth considerations that you should probably consider would be kind of, am I or a member of my team working outside of our appropriate area of competence? So, when all of us transitioned over, where a lot of people transitioned over to telehealth, we immediately saw that, like, there's a lot of differences between telehealth and working directly with kids. You have to be somewhat proficient with technology. Your pace has to be fast enough that it can engage the learner. You have to have good communication skills with the kid, but also with the parent, because you're no longer in a circumstance where you're going to be primarily just working with the kid. In most situations, the parent's going to be present too, particularly if we're looking at, coaching and feedback for the family member. You're also going to be, considerate of whether or not your team is dependent on being able to jump in and coach in the moment by modeling rather than by verbal description. So we definitely saw that, like, some of our team members really had more challenges when they weren't able to step in and say, let me show you how to do that, or watch this and now you try. But instead, when I have to, verbally walk you through those steps, that may be a different repertoire of skills that's not as proficient. So so those are all considerations. Can I perform appropriately? Am I within my zone of competence here? And a relevant, other element to this is, would providing services through telehealth possibly limit the negative impact of interruption to face-to-face care? So, if I can't see you because of safety issues, then, at least with telehealth, am I able to have some kind of resemblance of continuity of care, and how can I maximize that? So, and then, other issues, ethical issues that surround this is kind of, what if a family does not have adequate access to technology or the internet? How do we work through those situations? Or do we prioritize in-home services for those children over children that do have technology? Or do we just continue to evaluate on, some standard situation, and when all kids come off telehealth, we'll come back? Are we able to at least send resources and materials and check in through phone or email? So those are the kinds of things that are important to consider. The other major area that we had a little bit of experience with on our team was really looking at team morale and functioning. So, like, knowing that living in a pandemic is really a challenging experience that, to my knowledge, none of us have ever experienced before. So, if that those conditions can affect different people in different ways. And, for some of our team members, it may have had a more significant impact on their functioning overall and their kind of personal circumstances as a result of the changes in the conditions. Definitely could and did have an effect on the delivery of services. So what we did with our team is kind of assess and helped support. We provided a significant amount of supervision to try and identify if these issues were a concern. And I mean, even things like, a lot of people didn't have daycare. A lot of people didn't have grandparents available to help with childcare needs. So the responsibilities, the outside of work for a lot of people were significantly higher, and therefore, making it more challenging to complete the same tasks that we could do, or similar tasks that we could do prior to the circumstances being changed. So I think that was the final piece, was looking at, do I have the competence in this circumstance to provide the support? If I'm struggling, like, what supports do I need to put in place? What type of supervisory supports? What type of resources? What type of schedule adjustments do we need to make in order to support that change? Briefly, I'll just show a few examples of some of the other alternatives that we came up with as far as ways to potentially engage kids. So,
Show your finger.
Again, these training videos were just made for the teams that were working directly with our
Look at those cute
our
little
kiddos
fingers.
and our families,
I'm gonna eat 'em.
so that we could share them examples of what we were talking about when we said, hey, do you want to try some tele instruction, or hey, do you want to try some parent coaching? Because we felt like, walking into these situations blind is concerning, and we have parents saying, yeah, I want this service, when they really have no idea what the service is, and quite frankly, the staff is kind of just developing it as they go. And so you can see there was a variety of ways instruction was provided. Sometimes the instructor has materials on the other side of the screen. Sometimes they're using some type of digital modification. They might be projecting their desktop directly to them. And you can see even here, my daughter performs fairly well in this setting. And her instructor is awesome. And she's really selling it. I mean, I think she could sell it to anyone, that what she's doing on her side of the computer is awesome. That being said, given my daughter's instructional level, it's really not an ideal way to teach a child that has the needs that she has. So, as soon as we felt like we could safely integrate other services, including, parent coaching, more structured parent intensive instructional sessions, and then eventually bringing in outside help, that we felt that was really more appropriate for her based off of her needs. We also looked at things like developing some tools that if people
You're right.
didn't have access
Hey, Jeff, what's the mom doing?
to their materials, that they could utilize. So, some of our teams that we support didn't have card boxes for their kids and didn't have access to those materials. So we also work to try and come up with solutions where families could potentially access this content. And if parents wanted to work on some things, they could kind of pull up some instructional materials guided by their behavior analytic team that might be at an appropriate level. So given that schools aren't in session and there's a lot of the day that it isn't structured, having additional resources like these could be, were ways that we felt like could be helpful for families. So I think at the end of this circumstance, what we've looked at is kind of, now that we've been in home, yes, we weren't prepared to be in-home providers, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to continue to improve the quality of the services we're providing. But what it brought to the forefront of our analysis as providers is kind of, what is the conflict, what conflict exists, or what considerations should we be making when we look at the differences between kind of beautifully controlled clinically work and environmentally relevant family implemented programming. So I think, up until this point, the families that I've served largely did not get nearly an appropriate amount of family supported programming. And I don't think, having seen the benefits of, parents saying, hey, I knew how to talk to my kid when we went on a walk. I knew what questions they could answer, or, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much, you taught my child to sleep and my child hasn't slept ever before, or thank you so much for, helping us manage that after work time, which has been just a disaster for 6 weeks. So knowing, the benefit of working directly with parents to help them develop the skills that their kids need, going completely back to a situation of kind of a direct clinical where parents are not implementing the interventions, I think, presents some concerns. So, the question I kind of ask myself is it better to have a perfectly implemented protocol by a clinician, which may be with that child for 6 months, they may be with them for 4 years, but they're probably not going to be with them for their whole life. Or is it better to invest the time in parent training, or invest at least some portion of time into that parent training, because they'll be with their child for the entire lifetime. And I think, recognizing that there are a lot of variables that come into play into how successful those just different scenarios are. So how does the parent's capacity and skills and motivation play a role in this? I think those are important to consider. So, as we, as a result of the current circumstances, a lot of behavior analysts have had changes in schedules and circumstances and discontinuation of care, and, staff and layoffs, no access to technology. So, a couple of recommendations to consider when looking at the circumstances is kind of when your fiscal resources and or your staff are not available to provide support, what are some considerations you should probably look at? I think, reviewing the ethics code for contracts, fees, and financial arrangements is definitely necessary to make sure that you're being consistent with your legal obligations to the circumstances, but also reviewing the ethics code for guidance on interruption and discontinuation of service. And then, looking at your boundaries of competency and seeing is there an alternative method of service provision that's available? So, with these changes that have been made, I have to look at a number of these, at least these 3 areas in order to determine, what would be appropriate given kind of an abrupt change to a service schedule. And, I think the reality of our world right now is that fiscal relations and regulations do kind of play an influence on our clinical ethics to a degree, but our goals need to be for the role of the fiscal component to have as little influence on clinical treatment as possible. So no money, we want no money. We want mo money, no problems, not no money, more problems. So as logistics and reimbursement availability and other factors may change, it's probably likely that a lot of providers will be moving back into programs that where it's more clinical and more school-based and less in-home and parent training. So I think, some ethical considerations for that would be kind of looking at the environments of current and future service and the implications for teaching transferable skills that are important for quality of life, the density of instruction and fidelity of implementation concern. So how much time do you have with this kid, and how can you get the biggest bang for your buck, and what's the quality of that time, and how can you maximize it? And then also looking at kind of the relevance of developing skills and family members that potentially could support the individual over their lifetime. So if I know that this person is invested and going to be there for the long run, what do I need to teach them? And so then finally, the last component is kind of just looking at who are our obligations to. So, as BCBAs, we have ethical obligations, including a commitment to our science and research and practice, our clients, our colleagues, and our governing body. We're social beings with complicated circumstances, pre-COVID. now we're altering our services and our treatment for the conditions of the pandemic we're in. So my recommendations is to know the code. So our field has and does incredible things for improving the lives of individuals. And the work that is being done is incredible. And we need to protect and cherish that work, share that work, figure out how to grow that work so that we can, so that the benefits that my children are experiencing are being appreciated by as many people as can in this world. So I hope that there was elements of this discussion that have allowed you to think maybe a little bit differently about ethics and about ethical conduct in a number of situations. And I hope if you have any questions that you'll follow up with me. And I really appreciate your time. A 3-hour talk on ethics that's not live, I'm sure is challenging. So I hope that you were able to hang in there with me and that we'll sometime get to meet face to face. Thank you very much.